Okay, we're ready. We're rocking. Okay, so as I mentioned, we now have a joint presentation by Kristine Nemec and Carol Teator, which I think will touch on and uncover some of the underlying perceptions that we're seeing in integrated roadside vegetation management along roadsides, roadside right-of-ways. So the first presenter in this dual partner presentation is Kristine Nemec. She's or manages the Integrated Roadside Vegetation Management Program at the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. She previously worked at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the USDA Agricultural Research Service. She received a BS in Environmental Studies and an MA in Biology from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and a PhD in Natural Resources Science from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So welcome, Kristine.
Well, I don't think this one's advancing either. Maybe I'm not doing it right. All right. Yay.
Okay, it wasn't selected.
Okay. Thank you, Iris. Okay. So Carol and I will be discussing two different surveys looking at stakeholder perceptions of IRVM. We'd like to note that both of us also just received the results of our survey last week. So this is hot off the press. We'd like to acknowledge our research teams. For my study, I collaborated with Dr. Mary Loesch and Andrew Stevenson from the UNI Center for Social and Behavioral Research. Carol collaborated with Trees Forever. Well, she works for Trees Forever, and she collaborated with a steering committee consisting of different stakeholders from the environmental and transportation communities, and also Dr. Lynn Modernock with Mindfire Communications. So I'll begin with a little bit of history about IRVM in Iowa. It's been around since the late 1980s. At that time, there was a lot of concern about groundwater quality. There's concern about the effects that blanket spraying herbicides on rights-of-way had on water quality. In 1986, Iowa passed the Groundwater Protection Act. There's growing concern about the loss of tallgrass prairie, so conditions were ripe for a change in Iowa. Some conservationists suggested a more ecological approach to roadside management that reduced the use of herbicides. One of the most notable of those was Bill Haywood. He worked for Black Hawk County Conservation. He's a very charismatic person. He went around the state generating excitement about the idea of IRVM, and he was able to influence legislatures in the state to do something about it. So in 1988, the legislature passed Living Roadway Trust Fund legislation. This is administered by the Iowa DOT. It works with partners in Iowa to support IRVM programs and educate the public on the benefits and use of native plants and roadsides. It's funded in three ways. 3% of REAP funds from the Resource Enhancement and Protection Act, which comes from gaming receipts and license plate sales. It comes from a tax on utility easements and a road use tax fund. Last year, there was $889,000 available in this fund. There's probably going to be a similar amount available this year. And there's a formula the DOT uses to allocate this money among state, counties, and cities. They can apply for grants for different kinds of IRVM projects. Also that year, the legislature passed the IRVM legislation, which said it's declared to be in the general public welfare of Iowa and a highway purpose for the vegetation of Iowa's roadsides to be preserved, planted, and maintained to be safe, visually interesting, ecologically integrated, and useful for many purposes. So what that comes down to is the planting of natives along roadsides, but also reduced mowing and reduced use of herbicides, emphasize spot spraying of herbicides along roadsides. That's how we basically practice IRVM in Iowa, the three main components. The legislation said the state DOT shall provide an IRVM plan and program, so it's more mandatory, but a county may adopt an IRVM plan. So it's voluntary at the county level. So I manage the county roadside program. I provide support to counties that want to practice it. I provide training and education and networking opportunities. So being relatively new to my position, I wanted to learn more about what motivates counties to get involved in IRVM, which is kind of the genesis of this survey. So I'll show you how the counties vary and how involved they are in IRVM. Since 1998, the IRVM Program Office has gotten a grant from the Federal Highway Administration where we can distribute native seed mixes to counties that request it. So it's free to the counties. They have to provide the labor and the equipment to plant the seed. That's their responsibility. So as you can see, there's a range. Some counties are blank. They have never requested seed since 1998. But the counties, the number shows how many years they've gotten seed. So some counties have gotten 19 years worth of seed, so some are very involved. And the flowers don't signify anything, they're just kind of there for decoration. So if you're trying to figure that out, why does the county have a certain flower? Well, it's pretty. Some of the counties have a roadside manager. Those are the counties circled in red. A roadside manager is someone with a conservation background. They're really good with plant ID skills. They have this conservation ethic. They're dedicated to implementing RVM along the roadsides. If the county is not circled in red, the designated person responsible for the plant management along rights-of-way is the county engineer. Now, some of the counties, even if they don't have a roadside manager, they have an IRVM plan on file with the DOT. Those are circled in blue. So those two counties, the engineer has written an IRVM plan that shows they're thinking about how to actually apply it along the roadsides. They're implementing it. And if they have an IRVM plan on file with the DOT, they can apply for funding. So my goal is to support those existing programs and encourage more counties to practice IRVM. So for the survey, I wanted to know, how do county engineers and roadside managers perceive IRVM? What are the challenges and benefits to implementing it? And how is IRVM being implemented? So about half the questions actually had to do with that. How often do they mow or burn? How do they prevent invasive species coming to their county? But that's not the focus of this survey. I'm going to focus on the first question, or that's not the focus of this talk. I'll focus on the first question for this talk, but I do have information on the other results. So I collaborated with the UNI Center for Social and Behavioral Research with 2 social scientists there. They sent a survey to all Iowa roadside managers and all county engineers. So this is all the engineers, whether or not they had a roadside manager in their county. We still wanted to know what they thought about IRVM. An online link to the survey was mailed out to all of them. And after a few reminders, if they didn't respond to the online link, then a mailed survey was mailed to them. The data were collected in March and April of this year. We had a really good response rate. 65% of the engineers and 92% of the roadside managers responded. And we do have one of the recipients of the survey in the audience, Rob Roman, the Lynn County roadside manager, is in the back at table 8. So he has firsthand experience with actually taking the survey. So for the rest of the slides, the roadside manager response is in blue. The engineer response is in green. So one of the basic questions I had is, what do people consider when they're applying roadside management strategies? What's most important to them? The number one factor for both the managers and the county engineers was cost savings. How are we saving money and maintaining the roads? There were some significant differences. I thought it was kind of interesting. The roadside managers were more concerned about minimizing health or safety hazards than the engineers. And further down, the next to last option, engineers were more concerned about what the public thought than what roadside managers thought. So engineers are very concerned with those public complaints or input or what the public wants to see along the roads. And not surprisingly, the roadside managers are more likely to be swayed by vegetative diversity, that idea of environmental stewardship. We're also curious about why they were using native grasses or wildflowers along the roadside. The number one reason was revegetation, if the roadside is disturbed from a construction project, for example. Erosion control, stormwater management, landscaping, and snow control. Those were the 5 identified reasons for using the grasses and wildflowers. We gave them a list of 10 possible benefits of IRVM. We asked each of them to say if they strongly agreed all the way to strongly disagreed that that was a benefit of IRVM. So as you're looking at these, the darkest color is strongly agree. Towards the right, that's the strongly agreed responses. The next darkest color is agree. Gray is neutral, and the darkest gray is strongly disagree, just to orient yourself to what you're looking at here. Every single one of these 10 benefits, there is a significant difference in how the roadside managers and engineers perceived it. And all of these, the roadside manager perceived it as definitely a strongly agreed or agreed it was a benefit. So the first was provides attractive roadsides, maintains or improves water quality, enhances biodiversity. So we just talked about biodiversity in general. We didn't separate out the pollinators in this survey. Protects soil resources, promotes partnerships with other organizations, reduces spread of invasive species, optimizes the effectiveness of weed and pest control practices, reduces blowing snow, saves money both long and short term, makes roadways safer. So you can see these last 3 questions, there were some big differences, very big differences in how the engineers and roadside managers perceived these particular benefits. And we did separate the results out between engineers that do have a roadside manager and those that don't. And actually most of them had fairly similar results except for one. Engineers who had a roadside manager were much more likely to think that IRVM makes roadsides more attractive. So that was kind of interesting. If they had the roadside manager, they saw the beauty in the roadsides. We asked each person, what's your agency's experience with native vegetation? Is it not at all challenging? Is it slightly challenging to use natives? Somewhat challenging? Moderately challenging? Extremely challenging? And over half of roadside managers thought it was either not at all challenging or slightly challenging. So they had a good experience with natives. They didn't think they ran into that many obstacles. But the engineers, well over half the engineers, thought it was somewhat to extremely challenging to use natives. So anyone who responded was somewhat to extremely challenging, we then asked them a follow-up question. What are the primary challenges to using the natives? What have you found difficult about it? The number one response for both groups was the length of time to establish and/or the short growing season, followed by interference with native plantings by adjacent landowners who mow the plantings, interference with native plantings by adjacent landowners who spray the plantings with herbicides. So it's illegal in Iowa to be spraying the roadsides with herbicides. The roadsides are public property. They're under the management of the engineer or the roadside manager. But some landowners don't like the look, and they mow the roadsides or spray them. And followed by that, there's the cost of desired material and/or available agency funding, acceptance among contractors, public's desire for ornamentals or other non-natives. So that was kind of far down the list. There was a perception that that's not one of the biggest challenges is the public's desire for ornamentals or other non-natives. And then last, a lack of support from elected officials. Here's some of the written reasons people gave for not using natives. Cost, i.e. seed, labor, and maintenance until established. We use something that establishes faster for our major erosion issues. That's something that came up. If there's a big erosion issue, they weren't that into the natives. Stormwater management is needed during and directly after construction. It takes 2 years to get natives established. So while they are an integral part of the revegetation process, natives are not considered a stormwater tool. Current presumptions are that the right-of-way is not wide enough and that the tall native grasses actually cause more snow deposition on the roadway. That was from a roadside manager, and similarly, an engineer said, don't like the results. They catch the snow more and then cause it to drift onto the road. So there's this perception that the grasses actually cause more snow to drift on the road. But others, that I've talked to say no, that actually traps the snow and keeps it from drifting. So there's these two different perceptions that I've come across. That might need to be something that should be addressed, at least on county roadsides. So in conclusion, for this survey, the main considerations for roadside management, considerations of safety, soil erosion, cost, the barriers to greater use of native vegetation, cost and available funding, length of time for natives to establish, snow control issues, interference with the plantings by adjacent landowners. Perceived benefits. So the top three were the top three identified by both the engineers and the roadside managers. It's just that the roadside managers much more strongly agreed that they were the benefits. So those were enhances biodiversity, provides attractive roadsides, maintains or improves water quality, and followed by soil resources, promotes partnerships, reduces invasives, and increases weed and pest control practices. So I'm going to take these results and work with the social scientists to devise strategies to how we overcome these barriers that people are identifying. And another next step for this is also to survey the decision makers, the chairs of the county boards of supervisors, and the directors of county conservation boards. So these are the people who decide if they're going to hire a roadside manager or how much they want to spend on IRVM activities. So I think it's really important to consider the decision makers as well, if they're kind of controlling the purse strings and deciding to what extent this is going to be practiced, or if they're going to have someone dedicated to IRVM in their county. So I've applied for funding for that. So I would like to know, LRTF did fund both of our studies. So with that, I will pass it over to Carol for her to discuss the other survey that was recently done.
Okay, very interesting. Thanks, Kristine. So next, related survey, also done in Iowa, right? Okay. By Carol Teator at Trees Forever. She's the director of programs. And Trees Forever is a nonprofit organization working in Iowa and Illinois on urban forestry and transportation-related native plant restoration, with a special focus on water quality and pollinator habitat. Carol has her master's degree in both English and community regional planning from Iowa State University and a bachelor's degree from Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin, and she lives in Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
Okay. So as Kristine said, we just received the results of the survey that we did on behalf of the Living Roadway Trust Fund last week. And Dr. Lynn Modernach, who is the researcher with Mindfire Communications who did the survey, came in and presented to us, and she had 110 slides. And we have a binder of information with those slides and with comments that we were given. I distilled all those slides, you'll be happy to hear it, down to 20. So I have some of the flavor of what we've gotten out of this. We haven't fully gotten our mind around it. I did bring the binder, so maybe we can consult that if people have questions, but right now I'm going to put the binder down. So our research objectives for this study was to understand how typical Iowans, members of our stakeholder groups, and our legislators view the mission of the Living Roadway Trust Fund. As Kristine said, this was funded by the Living Roadway Trust Fund. And what we wanted to know were three things. Who are our target audiences and where do we reach them? What messages resonate with those audiences? And how do we best drive engagement and support, as well as perceptions of the value in LRTF initiatives? And this research will provide guidance to the Iowa Department of Transportation, the Living Roadway Trust Fund, Trees Forever, and all of our partners on how to communicate the impact and broad benefits of roadside native plantings. So who we talked to? We talked to a representative sample of the Iowa general population, and we identified those through a fielded those through a Nielsen opinion quest. So these are people who had indicated to Nielsen that they're willing to answer surveys. They're not necessarily people who are predisposed to have opinions about native plants or our roadsides. We also talked to our stakeholder groups, which are a little bit of the choir. It was composed of Trees Forever stakeholders, are the folks that we have contact information for. These were all electronic surveys. Iowa Native Plant Society, the Iowa Prairie Network, weed commissioners in Iowa, the Tallgrass Prairie Center and Byways of Iowa. The one group that we really were hoping to get to and we weren't able to get any traction, pun not intended, was the freight companies. We were hoping to identify, think of how many hours truckers spend on the road, and so we were trying to get an idea of their perceptions, but we weren't successful with that. We also talked to, well, I should say too, going back to the general population, we also tried to make sure we got an even distribution between rural and urban zip codes. So we wanted to make sure that was represented. The legislators, we did both qualitative executive interviews with the legislators and online surveys. We had identified 13 legislators for the researchers to talk with, and we only had 7 who were willing to talk. We sent out the survey to 149 legislators via email. Well, we sent an email invitation to them to participate, and we had 21 invitees actually take the survey. So we didn't get a good representation of the legislators. They were just out of the session this year and scattered off to their home districts. So we don't find, obviously that's not a good sample to work with. It's directional, but definitely not something that we felt confident to go forward with. And so I'm not going to talk about the legislators' responses too much in this presentation. I'm going to focus more on the general population and the stakeholders. I will say throughout the rest of this presentation, the general population is referred to as Iowans as opposed to the stakeholders. They're all Iowans. If they responded that they did not live in Iowa, they were thanked but asked not to continue. They were not able to continue. So I just wanted to make that point. You'll see Iowans and you'll see the stakeholders. So our sample for Iowans, we got 610 people responded. Again, this is just in folks who had indicated through a Nielsen that they were willing to take surveys. And of the stakeholders, we had 840 in the sample, and then we had the 21 legislators. So first we asked them what they thought about the appearance of our roadways in Iowa. And the majority, it was the classic bell curve, and pretty much it's meh, they're somewhat proud, maybe a little proud, not really proud in that, in general. There were some who were very proud and of course some who were not at all proud. So there's a lot going on in this survey. This is of Iowans, so this is the general population. And what I wanted to call your attention to are the first 2 lines. We asked them about issues of importance to them related to roadsides. And what they told us, you can see that there's over here, the importance to them, effectively managing water quality strategies, including stormwater runoff management, and efforts to support pollinators, including bees and butterflies, were the 2 that they said were very important to them. And then to the right of that, the satisfaction is very low of how we're addressing those issues in Iowa right now. So this is again the general population, and our stakeholders ranked the same top 2, water quality and pollinator habitat issues. And then they also identified knowing native plants and habitats will be preserved for future generations as both very important to them and issues that they're not very satisfied with how they're being addressed in Iowa. So then we asked them the likelihood to support, how likely they were to support efforts to address, and we asked loss of pollinator habitat, compromised water caused by runoff, Iowa being last in the U.S. for percentage of original natural habitat remaining, decreasing presence of native plants, and roadside management that doesn't interfere with crop producers. And what they told us was, again, loss of pollinator habitat and compromised water caused by runoff were of great significance to them, as well as the original habitat. So even though they didn't align with how they both felt about natural habitat, it started to come up, as did wildlife habitat, as something important to them and that they're willing to address. And that comes in significant, that becomes significant later when we start talking about how do we address these audiences. So then we asked them what they like to look at. What do they want our roads to look at? And we gave them some choices. These are the actual photos that they were able to look at when they were telling us what they preferred. So we gave them the top two photos are manage roadside prairie plantings and native landscaping. And these are actual sites in Iowa that we have. The middle two are mowed grass and landscape roadsides, so basically park-like. They wanted, if we asked them if they preferred that park-like setting, or mow the roadsides periodically for safety, but pretty much leave them alone. So we gave them pictures of Queen Anne's lace and wild parsnip. Drum roll, please. What we found out, both the stakeholders and Iowans and the general population managed roadside prairie plantings and native landscape. As you would guess with our stakeholders, that was 83%, a high percentage of them preferred that. But what we were really excited about is 49% of general Iowans preferred that, or general population of Iowans preferred the managed roadside prairie plantings and native landscaping. So this was very exciting, especially when it comes to trying to make sure that we message for them. And certainly we can, when we start messaging about LRTF, we can touch on pollinator or wildlife habitat, water quality management, cost-effective roadside management, preservation for future generations, and last but not least, beautification. Those all are encompassed by the Living Roadway Trust Fund. Now, even though I said I wasn't going to talk about the legislators, I will say that the legislators also tracked this way. 62% of them who responded, again, small sample, selected the managed roadside prairie plantings and native landscaping. However, 38% of them said that they preferred that park-like look, the mowed look. And of those legislators who indicated that, most of them came from the rural farm areas, and there might be some cultural ties there, although we'll get to some of that segmentation here in a bit. But the short of it is that our legislators also agreed that managed roadside prairie planting and native landscaping is what they preferred. So then we asked, well, what do we call it? If we're going to try to message to them, what are some of the names that they most respond to? At the bottom was integrated roadside vegetation management, as you might not be surprised, of the names that we asked them to rank. And at the top, among both the Iowans and the stakeholders, was native plant restoration. That spoke to them. That term spoke to them. And then native landscaping, living roadways, and roadside beautification also received fairly high responses. We did have an open-ended question after this one asking, well, what would you call it? And I haven't had time to go through all of the responses, but I will say somebody, it's a little lengthy, but somebody suggested we call it Iowa finally stops killing every plant that isn't corn and beans. It'd be hard to fit on a sign. But I actually look forward to looking through those. I think there are going to be some good fun responses there. So I'm going to have a few slides here to talk about the segmentation of the general population, just to give you an idea of who responded and where they're coming from, because again, that'll affect the messaging that we develop. So they basically fell into 3 groups, and I have a few slides to drill down on these groups a little bit more, but we have the concerned country dwellers that made up 46% of the respondents, and then a group called the discontented commuters that made up 39%, and then the unengaged city people. The concerned country dwellers was the largest segment, as I said, and these are highly engaged people who either live in rural communities or are farm residents, and they indicated in the survey where they lived, if it was on the farm or in a rural community. And these people tend to be very proud of the appearance of Iowa and its roadsides. They care a lot about conservation and environmental concerns, as indicated by their responses. They're happier with the state of Iowa's conservation efforts than the other segments, but they're still not very satisfied with it. And they're most likely to be members of environmental groups or agricultural groups or groups that are concerned with water quality or outdoor recreation. And in general, their demographics, they were 18 to 49 and had household incomes of 20 to 60,000 annually. The discontented commuters reside in the suburbs or rural communities. They tend to have higher income and are more professional than the other segments. They spend a lot of time in their cars commuting and have a very dismal level of pride in our roadsides in Iowa, not very happy with Iowa's conservation efforts. They care about environment and conservation concerns, but not quite as much as the concerned country dwellers. And they don't see the value in LRTF. The Living Roadway Trust Fund initiatives aren't necessarily important to them personally, and they're less likely to be members of groups that are concerned about agriculture, water quality, environment. They tracked the same age, 18 to 49, and they had a little bit higher annual income. And then there was the unengaged city people. And these tended to be, those who responded to us are older, lower income segments of the population, somewhat apathetic about conservation and environment. Essentially, as you see in the last bullet point, nothing in particular was important to this group. They tended to be older and about 40,000 annual household income. So the recommendations that came out of this, again, we wanted to find out who our target audiences are for the messaging about the Living Roadway Trust Fund mission, as well as roadsides, natives in our roadsides. So, did you see it? Okay. Concerned country dwellers, discontented commuters, and stakeholders in that order of priority. So as we're addressing our audiences, that's who we want to try to reach. What messages resonate most with those groups, especially those 3 groups that we just listed? The message with the widest support is pollinator habitat conservation and restoration. It doesn't have to be the loudest all the time that we say, but it has to be consistent in all the messaging. And then water quality management is of critical importance, and we have to do our job to demonstrate how native plant restoration helps manage stormwater runoff and as a priority for our communications. And also of high resonances are the habitat that is the habitat for wildlife that Rights of Way provide. Rights of Way with native plant restoration. So respondents expressed a sincere desire to preserve what we have for future generations. And maintaining that link between our heritage and what our children are able to see in the future is what's going to help us engage the target audiences and garner support. The people who live and work in Iowa now and for generations to come are what the Iowans who responded to our survey care about. Sorry for you folks who are from other states, but they're not as concerned about your perceptions of our state. It's more about who's living there and who's going to be living there in the future. Managed prairie plantings and native landscaping is what they want to see along the roads. But it's not just about the look and perceptions of beauty along the roads. What we need to do and what we need to help them understand is that native plant restoration along our roadways address the many environmental concerns that we face and that they've told us that they're concerned about. And that's all I have. Thank you.